Obi was born in a small village in the east, the youngest of 5 children. His parents were poor farmers who scraped by on meager harvests and occasional odd jobs. Young Obi watched as his siblings left school one by one, unable to afford the fees, and vowed that his fate would be different. From an early age, Obi showed a keen intelligence and a ruthless determination. He would study by candlelight long after his family had gone to sleep, borrowing tattered textbooks from sympathetic teachers. When he wasn't studying, he was working, running errands for shopkeepers, helping neighbors with their farms, doing anything to earn a few extra naira. His efforts paid off when he won a scholarship to study in Lagos. The day he left his village, his mother tearfully pressed a small parcel into his hands. Inside was a single, gleaming kobo coin, everything she could spare. "Remember where you came from," she whispered, her calloused hands gripping his. "And always be kind to those less fortunate." But Lagos had other plans for young Obi. The city was a shock to his system. The noise, the crowds, the sheer scale of it all overwhelmed him. He found himself in a world where kindness was often seen as weakness, where the strong preyed on the vulnerable, and where money talked louder than anything else. Obi threw himself into his studies with a fervor that bordered on obsession. He graduated top of his class and quickly landed a job at a prestigious bank. His colleagues marveled at his work ethic, but few knew the driving force behind it, a deep-seated fear of returning to the poverty of his childhood. As the years passed, Obi climbed the corporate ladder with dizzying speed. He invested wisely, buying up properties across Lagos when the market was low. Before long, he had amassed a small fortune and a considerable portfolio of buildings. It was then that Obi made a decision that would change the course of his life. He quit his job at the bank to manage his properties full-time. "I'll be my own boss," he declared proudly to his friends. "No more answering to anyone else." At first, Obi was a fair landlord. He kept his buildings in good repair and charged reasonable rents. But as his empire grew, so did his appetite for more. He began to see his tenants not as people, but as sources of income. The memory of his mother's words faded, replaced by the cold logic of profit margins and return on investment. Obi's heart hardened, calcifying like the concrete of his buildings. He raised rents without warning, ignored pleas for repairs, and evicted tenants at the slightest provocation. Children would hide behind their mothers' skirts when they saw him coming, and grown men would tremble at the sound of his voice. One of these buildings, a dilapidated 4-story structure in the heart of Surulere, housed some of Lagos's poorest residents. Among them was Chidi, a struggling artist who painted vibrant canvases that no one seemed to want to buy. Chidi's neighbor, Funmi, was a single mother who worked 2 jobs to support her young son, Tunde. Across the hall lived old Mr. Adamola, a retired teacher who spent his days tending to a small rooftop garden, the plants his only companions. These tenants, and many others like them, lived in constant fear of Obi's wrath. They scrimped and saved, often going without food to pay their rent on time. But no matter how hard they tried, it never seemed to be enough for the merciless landlord. As Obi's wealth grew, so did his isolation. He lived alone in a luxurious penthouse, surrounded by expensive furnishings that brought him no joy. His family had long since cut ties with him, unable to reconcile the cold-hearted tycoon with the ambitious boy they once knew. Obi told himself he didn't need them, that he didn't need anyone. All he needed was the growing number in his bank account. Little did Obi know that his world was about to be turned upside down. For in this sprawling city of millions, fate was weaving a tapestry of lives that would soon intersect in ways none could have imagined. And at the center of it all was a young widow named Amara, whose arrival would set in motion a chain of events that would shake Obi's empire to its very foundations. But that, my children, is where our story truly begins. As the scorching Lagos sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the bustling streets, a battered taxi pulled up in front of Obi's building in Surulere. From it emerged Amara, a young woman with tired eyes but a determined set to her jaw. In her arms, she cradled a sleeping infant, while a wide-eyed toddler clung to her skirt. Amara had come to Lagos with hope in her heart and little else. Just months ago, she had been living a modest but happy life in Enugu with her husband, Emeka. But fate had dealt her a cruel hand. Emeka, a construction worker, had fallen from scaffolding at a job site. The company, more concerned with avoiding liability than helping the family, had quickly washed their hands of the matter. With mounting medical bills and no income, Amara had been forced to sell everything they owned. Now, here she stood, a widow at 26, with 2 young children and dreams that seemed to shrink with each passing day. But Amara was not one to give up easily. She had heard of job opportunities in Lagos, of a city where anything was possible if you worked hard enough. With the last of their savings, she had made the journey, clinging to the promise of a fresh start. As Amara climbed the creaky stairs to her new apartment, she tried to ignore the peeling paint and the smell of mildew that permeated the air. The flat was small, just one room with a tiny attached kitchen, but it was all she could afford. She set her sleeping baby on the bare floor and turned to her older child, forcing a smile. "See, Nkem, this is our new home. Isn't it exciting?" The little girl looked around dubiously, but nodded, not wanting to disappoint her mother. As Amara began to unpack their meager belongings, a knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find a kind-faced woman standing there, holding a steaming pot. "Welcome, neighbor," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Funmi. I live next door with my son, Tunde. I thought you might be hungry after your journey." Amara's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting the pot with trembling hands. "I'm Amara." Over a simple meal of jollof rice and plantains, Amara learned more about her new home and its inhabitants. Funmi spoke of the other tenants, Chidi the artist, old Mr. Adamola with his rooftop garden, and others. But when Amara asked about their landlord, Funmi's face darkened. "Obi," she said, her voice low, "you'd do well to stay out of his way. Pay your rent on time and don't ever ask him for anything. The man has no heart." As if summoned by his name, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Angry voices rose, punctuated by the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Amara and Funmi rushed to the door to see what was happening. In the dim light of the corridor, they saw 2 burly men manhandling a frail old woman down the stairs. Behind them strode Obi, his expensive suit at odds with the run-down surroundings. His face was a mask of cold indifference as he watched the old woman plead and struggle. "Please, Mr. Obi," she cried, her voice cracking. "Just give me 1 more week. My pension hasn't come through yet." Obi's response was chilling in its calm. "You've had your chances, Mama. I run a business, not a charity. If you can't pay, you can't stay." As the old woman was unceremoniously deposited on the street, her few possessions tossed after her, Amara felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to Funmi, whose face was a mixture of anger and resignation. "Does this happen often?" Amara whispered. Funmi nodded grimly. "More often than you'd think. Obi shows no mercy, not even to the old or the sick." As they watched Obi stride away, his polished shoes clicking on the worn steps, Amara made a silent vow. She would do whatever it took to keep a roof over her children's heads. She would work her fingers to the bone if she had to. But she would not let her family end up on the streets. Little did Amara know that her arrival had set in motion a series of events that would shake the very foundations of Obi's carefully constructed world. For in this building, among these struggling tenants, a storm was brewing. And at its eye was a force more powerful than Obi's greed, the unbreakable spirit of those who have nothing left to lose. As night fell over Lagos, the city's lights flickering to life like earthbound stars, the residents of Obi's building settled into an uneasy sleep. But for Amara, lying on the hard floor with her children nestled against her, sleep remained elusive. In the darkness, she whispered a prayer, not for herself, but for all those who called this place home. Little did she know that somewhere in the vastness of the universe, someone, or something, was listening. As the days turned into weeks, Amara settled into the rhythms of her new life in Lagos. She found work as a cleaner in a nearby office building, rising before dawn to get her children ready and dropping them off with Funmi before rushing to her job. The hours were long and the pay meager, but Amara attacked her tasks with a fierce determination. Every naira she earned brought her one step closer to security for her family. Meanwhile, life in the building continued its precarious dance. Chidi the artist had taken to painting in the stairwell, his vibrant murals bringing unexpected beauty to the dingy walls. Old Mr. Adamola's rooftop garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables that he quietly shared with his neighbors, and Funmi had started a small, informal daycare, watching over the building's children while their parents worked. But over it all loomed the shadow of Obi. His visits to the building became more frequent, his demands more stringent. He raised the rent without warning, claiming rising costs. When the ancient elevator finally gave out, he refused to repair it, forcing elderly tenants to struggle up multiple flights of stairs. One sweltering afternoon, as Amara was returning from work, she found a crowd gathered in front of the building. At its center stood Obi, facing off against Chidi. The artist's hands were covered in paint, his eyes blazing with anger. "You can't do this!" Chidi shouted. "These murals bring joy to everyone here. They hurt no one." Obi's face was a mask of cold fury. "This is my property," he snarled. "I didn't give you permission to deface it. Paint over them by tomorrow or you're out." As Obi turned to leave, his eyes met Amara's. For a moment, something flickered in their depths. A hint of recognition, perhaps, or a shadow of the man he once was. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual icy stare. That night, as the building slept, Amara couldn't shake the memory of that look in Obi's eyes. On an impulse, she crept down to the stairwell. In the dim light, Chidi's murals seemed to come alive. Vibrant scenes of market life, children playing, a sunrise over Lagos Lagoon. With a heavy heart, Amara picked up a brush and began to paint. Hours later, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Amara stepped back to survey her work. Where Chidi's murals had been, there was now a coat of dull beige paint. But looking closely, one could see that the outlines of the original artwork remained barely visible beneath the surface. When Obi arrived later that morning for his inspection, he found the stairwell transformed. A smug smile played on his lips as he ran a hand over the blank walls. "Much better," he muttered. But as he turned to leave, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He blinked, certain he was imagining things. For a moment, just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a flash of color beneath his fingers, as if the painted figures were dancing just out of sight. Shaking his head, Obi hurried from the building, unaware that he had just witnessed the first crack in the facade of his carefully controlled world. As word of Amara's nighttime efforts spread through the building, something began to change. The tenants, who had long lived in fear and isolation, started to come together. They began to share meals, to watch each other's children, to lend a helping hand where needed. It was as if Chidi's hidden murals had woven an invisible thread, connecting them all. But with this newfound unity came a growing sense of resistance. Whispered conversations in hallways turned into clandestine meetings in Mr. Adamola's rooftop garden. Plans were made, strategies discussed. For the first time, the tenants dared to hope that they might be able to stand up to Obi's tyranny. Unaware of the changes brewing in his building, Obi continued his ruthless practices across his real estate empire. He evicted a young family from one of his properties in Ikeja, ignoring the mother's pleas that her child was recovering from malaria. In Lekki, he bought a block of flats and immediately doubled the rent, forcing out long-time residents to make way for wealthier tenants. With each callous act, Obi's wealth grew, but so did the hollow feeling in his chest. He filled his empty penthouse with expensive artwork and rare antiquities. But nothing could fill the void left by his lost humanity. One night, as Obi sat alone in his luxurious living room, a strange wind blew through the open balcony doors. It carried with it the sense of his childhood village, earthy petrichor, smoky cooking fires, the sweet fragrance of ripening mangoes. For a moment, Obi felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. Was it longing? Regret? But before he could examine the feeling, his phone rang. It was his property manager, calling about a problem at the Surulere building. Pushing aside the uncomfortable emotions, Obi slipped back into his role as the merciless landlord. Little did he know that the winds of change were blowing, not just through his penthouse, but through the very foundations of the empire he had built. And at the heart of it all was Amara, a woman whose quiet strength was about to unleash a force that even Obi couldn't have foreseen. As Lagos settled into another restless night, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. In the coming days, the fates of Obi, Amara, and all the residents of the Surulere building would become inexorably intertwined, leading to a reckoning that none of them could have imagined. As the full moon cast its eerie glow over Lagos, tension in the Surulere building reached a breaking point. Obi had announced another rent hike, this time a staggering 50% increase. For most of the tenants, it was an impossible demand. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. The sound of muffled sobs from neighboring apartments mingled with the distant honking of cars and the ever-present hum of the city. Making a decision, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her children. In the dim hallway, she found she wasn't alone. Other doors were opening, faces peering out with a mixture of fear and determination. Without a word, they all made their way to Mr. Adamola's rooftop garden. Under a canopy of stars, and amidst the old man's carefully tended plants, the tenants gathered. Amara looked around at the faces illuminated by moonlight. Funmi with dark circles under her eyes, Chidi with paint-stained hands, Mr. Adamola leaning heavily on his cane, and many others. Each face told a story of struggle, of dreams deferred, of lives hanging by a thread. "We can't go on like this," Amara said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the night air. "If we don't stand up to Obi now, we'll all be on the streets." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, but it was tinged with fear. "But what can we do?" someone asked. "Obi has all the power." It was then that Chidi spoke up, his artist's eyes gleaming with inspiration. "Maybe not all the power," he said. "Remember the murals? They're still there, beneath the surface. What if we could make Obi see what he's trying to erase?" As the night wore on, a plan began to take shape. It was daring, perhaps even foolhardy, but it was born of desperation and hope, a potent combination. Little did they know that at that very moment, Obi was facing his own crisis. In his penthouse, he tossed and turned, plagued by vivid dreams. He saw his childhood village, his mother's weathered face twisted in disappointment. He saw the old woman he had evicted, her frail form huddled on the street, and he saw Amara, her eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and compassion that shook him to his core. Obi woke with a start, sweat beading on his forehead. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of doubt. Was this really the man he had become? As dawn broke over Lagos, both Obi and the tenants prepared for battle, each in their own way. Obi donned his most expensive suit, armor against the world. The tenants gathered their meager resources, fortified by their newfound unity. When Obi arrived at the Surulere building later that morning, he was met with an eerie silence. The usual sounds of life, children playing, radios blaring, the clatter of cooking pots, were absent. Frowning, he made his way up the stairs. As he climbed, something strange began to happen. With each step, flashes of color seemed to bleed through the dull beige walls. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he reached the second floor, the images became clearer. Chidi's murals were reappearing, more vibrant than ever, but they were different now. Mixed with the scenes of Lagos life were faces, faces of the tenants, their hopes and dreams painted in bold strokes. And there, at the center of it all, was Obi himself, portrayed not as the hard-hearted landlord, but as the ambitious young man who had once dreamed of making a difference. Obi stood transfixed, his hand outstretched toward his painted self. As his fingers touched the wall, the mural seemed to come to life. The figures began to move, telling their stories in a swirl of color and light. He saw Funmi working her 2 jobs, the exhaustion etched on her face as she cared for her son. He saw Chidi pouring his soul into his art, creating beauty in the midst of hardship. He saw Mr. Ademola tending his garden, nurturing life in the concrete jungle. And he saw Amara, her strength and resilience shining like a beacon. As Obi watched, transfixed, he felt something shift inside him. The walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. Suddenly, he became aware of a presence behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with Amara and the other tenants. They stood united, their faces a mixture of fear and determination. "What is the meaning of this?" Obi demanded, but his voice lacked its usual force. Amara stepped forward, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "This is who we are, Mr. Obi," she said softly. "This is the life you're trying to squeeze out of us. But we won't go quietly. We can't." For a long moment, Obi said nothing. The only sound was the faint hum of the city outside. Then, to everyone's shock, a single tear rolled down his cheek. I had forgotten," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I had forgotten what it was like to struggle, to dream, to hope." As the sun climbed higher in the Lagos sky, casting long shadows through the stairwell windows, a transformation began to take place. Not just in the building with its mysteriously reappearing murals, but in Obi himself. The hard shell of the merciless landlord began to crack, revealing glimpses of the man he once was. The boy from a poor village who had dared to dream of a better life. And as he looked into the faces of his tenants, seeing not just rent payments, but fellow human beings with their own hopes and struggles, Obi felt something he hadn't experienced in years: shame. But with that shame came an opportunity, a chance for redemption, for change, for a new beginning. As Obi stood there, surrounded by the very people he had oppressed for so long, he made a decision that would alter the course of all their lives. As Obi stood there, surrounded by the tenants he had wronged for so long, the weight of his actions came crashing down upon him. The silence stretched on, thick with tension and unspoken words. Then, to everyone's surprise, Obi slowly sank to his knees, his expensive suit crumpling against the worn floor. I don't know where to begin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've become something I never meant to be. A monster." Amara, moved by a compassion she didn't know she still possessed for this man, knelt beside him. "It's not too late to change," she said softly. "To make things right." Obi looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For the first time in years, the cold mask of indifference had fallen away, revealing the vulnerable human beneath. "How?" he asked, his voice cracking. "How can I possibly make up for all the pain I've caused?" It was Mr. Ademola who spoke next, his wizened voice carrying the weight of years. "By remembering who you once were, son. By becoming that person again." Over the next few hours, as the sun climbed higher in the Lagos sky, an extraordinary meeting took place in the stairwell of that old building. Tenants shared their stories of hardship, of dreams deferred, of the daily struggle to survive. And Obi listened, really listened, for the first time in years. As he heard tale after tale, memories of his own past came flooding back. He remembered the feeling of going to bed hungry, of watching his parents work themselves to the bone, of the burning desire to create a better life. Somewhere along the way, in his pursuit of wealth and power, he had lost sight of why he had started this journey in the first place. As the day wore on, a plan began to take shape. It was Chidi who first suggested the idea, his artist's mind always seeking creative solutions. "What if," he said, "we turned this building into a cooperative, where everyone has a stake, everyone contributes what they can?" The idea took root, growing and evolving as others chimed in. Funmi spoke of creating a communal childcare center, freeing parents to work without worry. Mr. Ademola proposed expanding his rooftop garden, providing fresh produce for all. Others suggested skill-sharing workshops, a community kitchen, a small library. And Obi, to everyone's amazement, listened and nodded, his sharp business mind already calculating how to make it work. "I can provide the initial investment," he said, "to repair the building to get everything started. And I have other properties. We could expand this model, create a network of cooperative living spaces across Lagos." As night fell once again, the atmosphere in the building had transformed. Where once there had been fear and resentment, now there was cautious hope. Plans were made, committees formed, tasks assigned. It wouldn't be easy. Years of mistrust and pain couldn't be erased overnight. But it was a start. Obi, exhausted but oddly exhilarated, made his way back to his penthouse. But as he stood in the vast empty space, surrounded by his expensive possessions, he felt a deep sense of unease. This place, which he had once seen as the pinnacle of success, now felt cold and lifeless compared to the vibrant community he had just left. Making a sudden decision, he began to pack a small bag. He would return to the Surulere building, to live among the people he had wronged, to work alongside them in creating this new vision. It was time to remember what truly mattered. As Obi locked up his penthouse, possibly for the last time, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The path ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Back in Surulere, Amara tucked her children into bed, her mind whirling with the day's events. As she kissed her youngest on the forehead, she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. For in the midst of their greatest crisis, a miracle had occurred, not just for her family, but for all of them. Outside, the Lagos night was alive with its usual cacophony of sounds. Car horns, distant music, the hum of millions of lives intersecting. But in that old building in Surulere, a new sound could be heard. The sound of hope, of community, of a future reimagined. As the city slept, the old woman who had cursed Obi all those weeks ago smiled to herself. Her work was done. For she was no ordinary woman, but a manifestation of the spirit of Lagos itself, a city of hardship and hope, of struggle and triumph. She had seen the potential for change in Obi's heart and had set in motion the events that would unlock it. With a satisfied nod, she faded into the night, becoming one with the city once more. Her last thought was of the future, of the ripples this transformation would send out across Lagos, changing lives in ways no one could yet imagine. And so, as a new day dawned over the city, the story of Obi Amara and the tenants of that old building in Surulere was just beginning. It was a story of redemption, of community, of the power of compassion to transform even the hardest of hearts. But most of all, it was a story of Lagos itself, a city of endless possibilities, where even the most unlikely miracles could, and did, happen every day.